I'm Joe Trotter, the Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force Director here at ALEC. And I'm happy to introduce Brad Viator, who's going to be talking to us about the difference between traditional and deregulated pricing for energy markets. So Brad made a career of advising companies and trade associations about navigating the complex world of legislative, regulatory, media environments, and all the fun that goes into that. He is the founder of Be Strategic, and before that, serving as one of the vice presidents of external affairs at the Edison Electric Institute, which represents investor-owned electric utilities. He's been a huge proponent in state legislators and regulatory leaders, and we're happy to have him here to talk about this emerging issue. So without further ado, Brad.
Thanks, Joe.
It's all you.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to come and speak to all of you here. Just to go over how exactly it's going to work, Joe. So if people have questions, there's like an option for them to type questions in or something like that. Is that accurate?
There is a Q&A at the bottom of the screen and a chat function, but please do questions in the Q&A.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Joe. And thanks everybody for thanks ALEC for the opportunity, and thanks everybody for listening. So that's what I'm going to talk about, the differences kind of between traditionally regulated utility markets and deregulated energy markets. Deregulated is kind of a misnomer. A lot of times you hear people call them restructured energy markets because, as a practical matter, it's just different regulation. There's still a lot of regulation involved. It's just a question of who the regulator is. So a little bit about me, Joe. Thank you for the kind introduction. I've learned I'm a utility expert. I specialize in state policy trends and kind of the structure of the utility business, and starting to figure out exactly how you create the right incentives to ensure that utilities are making investments that are in the best interests of customers. As Joe mentioned, I ran external affairs for EI, was there for about 11 years, and then founded my own firm last summer. And I get to do things like this, talk about policy issues with state legislators, governors, et cetera. So that's me. So we kind of have to go back when we're talking about sort of traditionally regulated utility markets. We have to go far, far back in time to really get an understanding of how we ended up in a world where states decided to grant certificates of service and regulated monopolies to electric utilities. And the origin of that, think back to, the robber barons in the 1800s, and this whole concept of people were creating monopolies were developing all of this market power. It really all is built upon this court case, the Binghamton Bridge Supreme Court case of 1865. And as it says on the screen, if you will embark with your time, money, and skill in an enterprise which will accommodate the public necessities, we will grant to you for a limited time period or in perpetuity privileges that will justify the expenditure of your money and the employment of your time and skill. Basically saying, if you're going to do some stuff in the public good, and we're going to help you define what the public good is, you have a right to earn a little bit of money for deploying that capital or to earn some profit. So that's really the beginning of the regulated utility business. And I guess another key reason that the business developed this way with what many would suggest is a natural monopoly is because the capital costs of building electric infrastructure are so incredibly high. The electric utility industry spends more on CapEx than any other industry in the country, about $120 billion a year. And sort of since it's so expensive, cities oftentimes don't have the resources to really expend the necessary capital. So the idea was we'll go out and create this public-private partnership. These big investment firms will more or less just raise capital to invest in energy infrastructure. And as a result of them raising that capital and building that infrastructure, we'll give them a reasonable rate of return. So that's kind of how the business started, to sort of give some protections for those investors who are deploying, really large amounts of capital. The state decided to grant the utility an exclusive right to a customer base. And hold on, I gotta see what happened here. Hold on, am I still there? Everybody there? Cancel. I don't want to reload my site. Hold on one second here. Let me pause share and see what I've got going on with my computer. Joe, are you still there? Can y'all hear me?
I would hit cancel and then just click out of the site entirely.
Yeah, I did. It's not letting it. All right, here we go. So there we are. So as I was saying, I guess oh my gosh, this thing really hates me at the moment. As I was saying, the granting of the defined service area, which is in effect the defined customer base, is the thing that the regulated utility that is facing investors and is out there trying to raise capital sort of requires to be able to go out and raise all the necessary capital. They're able to tell investors, hey, I've got these 2 million customers that I serve. I have this certificate that tells me I am the only one that will serve their needs. And as a result of that, the capital costs are pretty low because there's an expectation that, they're going to be able to sort of spread those costs across the entirety of that customer base. There we go. That's kind of the same piece. So that gets us to the next component, which is sort of how the rates themselves are developed. They utilize what's called a just and reasonable standard, which applies the justness, I guess, and reasonableness applies equally to the customer and the utility. So the idea, I guess, in the end, is to set a rate that serves the need of the customer base, which is approximate to the rate that customers would pay in a competitive market. So the utility regulators kind of look at all this stuff. They see what the charges are going to be to a customer, and then they sort of imagine what the competitive price would be. Do these prices seem to be in line? Or are they out of whack? The utility will make a recommendation of how much money they want to spend and how much they would like to charge customers. And then the utility regulator will sort of edit that plan. They will come back and say, this seems too expensive. Did you do this other thing appropriately, et cetera? So that's kind of how that rate setting process works. The accountability of the regulator, the accountability of the utility is kind of defined by the Public Utility Commission, and it really varies as to who the are. In 39 states, I think 38 states, the public utility commissioners are appointees of the governor. In 10 states, the public utility commissioners, 10 or 11, the public utility commissioners are elected just by voters, and it kind of varies. Sometimes they have a district, other times they are statewide candidates. And then in one instance, in South Carolina, the regulators are appointed by the state legislature, sort of appointed and confirmed by the state legislature. So there's some level of accountability to these regulators. One, if they're elected, obviously there's accountability to a voter, or there's accountability through either the governor's office or the state legislature. Okay, so that's kind of the background. That's a little bit of the history of, sort of how the regulated system works. So why exactly did we start having this discussion about deregulation? We really started having this discussion about deregulation because there were a lot of other regulated industries that were beginning to deregulate. And frankly, we're having a lot of success doing it. Telecommunications industry probably being the best example. Many of you will remember this, but essentially in 1984, AT&T sort of broke up all of its little Baby Bell systems. It had to divest of all those Baby Bell companies and just become a long distance service provider, which was the result of a lawsuit at the FCC. And when that whole marketplace broke up, what you really started to see in the telecom industry was a couple of big emergent significant investors. Some of the biggest ones are names that we know now, probably the providers of our cell phone plans, with AT&T and Verizon, principally among them, Sprint kind of to a lesser degree. So they sort of deregulated that system. All of a sudden, you had companies that represented the entirety of the country. They went from these smaller defined service areas to being able to provide service across much broader swaths of land. And you saw a ton of innovation, right? Like cell phones obviously started to take off. And now, most of us don't even have the landlines that were regulated by the public utility commissions that also regulate electric companies. So there was a lot of success in that market, and we saw a lot of competition, which really drove down prices. So folks on the electricity side of the equation, and frankly, regulators who had just been regulating telephone companies and saw a lot of success around deregulation, began to start to consider how exactly we would deregulate electricity. And there's also this big move, there's a big move all across in the kind of like Reagan era into the first Bush era and even the Clinton administration. There's this concept that regulation is bad, deregulation is good and should be the goal. So so this whole discussion kind of started. It really began over in the UK. England and Wales were the first places in the world to deregulate the electricity system. The thing kind of went into effect in 1996. California quickly followed suit in 1996 and deregulated their electricity. They were followed by Texas, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts. And the idea that was being pitched at that time was that in much the same way that 2 or 3 big investors were going to compete against one another and sort of own these assets all across the country like they did in telecom, 2 or 3 big owners of infrastructure would emerge and they would compete against one another. And so we would sort of see the benefit of a bunch of falling prices. As Ken Lay, the founder, CEO, and chairman of Enron famously said, you'll have lower prices under deregulation than you will through regulation, right? That was the concept. It sort of stands to reason that this would be the case. So what happened? Why does Enron matter? How is any of this stuff related? Well, the idea was that there were going to be big investors that were going to own all of these power plants all across the country, and there might be 1, 2, 3 of them. They would compete against one another and prices would be driven down. Enron was really the one that was driving this narrative more than anybody else. And frankly, a lot of state policymakers, a lot of national policymakers were, this was like a darling of the investment community. They were pretty convinced that that was going to happen. Well, then 2000, 2001, this company Enron, which was a darling of Wall Street, all of a sudden began to unravel. And we began to learn that, they were misstating a lot of their earnings and their financial heft. And, these promises that were made to these states that decided to deregulate, that Enron was going to come in and own all of the electric infrastructure, began to kind of fall apart. And what that did to these marketplaces is take away the emergent sort of owner of energy infrastructure. So Enron disappears, and now you're kind of left with a couple of bit players who can cobble together enough resources to own a few of these power plants, but not the oversupply of power plants that we were promised, that were really going to lead to prices being driven down in electricity. On top of that, there was this big energy crisis in California where we had a bunch of rolling blackouts from 2000 and 2001. And this was sort of in the midst of all these states passing legislation saying they were going to deregulate their electricity. You had the power going out all across the state of California, in large part due to some of the market manipulation that Enron was engaging in. But also, as a practical matter, these markets are built to be incredibly efficient and not have any excess electricity available. Right? Well, when all of a sudden you have a big demand spike and there's no excess electricity available, the power just goes out. So California energy crisis kind of became an inflection point for the deregulation movement. And a bunch of states which had started to deregulate kind of decided that they didn't want to anymore. I'll list those kind of at the bottom: Arizona, Arkansas, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Oregon, and West Virginia. There are a few others. The Commonwealth of Virginia decided to re-regulate a few years later, but the California energy crisis and the Enron collapse really caused a lot of this discussion to stop in its tracks. As I kind of said before, I think these are things that I've more or less already covered. But Enron was claiming in state legislatures and at FERC that if these markets were restructured, the company would come in and would buy a bunch of these gas-fired plants all over the country, become the dominant provider. It would increase competition and drive down prices. I still think there is a potential that could have happened had Enron been a real company and had their books actually made sense. But there wasn't a player out there that could harness the necessary capital to go in and make all of those investments. Okay, so now we're in a world where we've got these deregulated electricity markets. The big ones are kind of what I talked about in the beginning, like all of New England, for the most part, except for Vermont, is in a deregulated electricity market. New York, kind of the mid-Atlantic, so north of DC, or DC and north, so Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, all that stuff is deregulated. And then you've got ERCOT in Texas and California. The sort of bastions of traditional regulation are the Deep South. So the southeastern United States is traditionally regulated. And then the West, or the Intermountain West in particular, but the West other than California is also traditionally regulated. And the difference in how they prepare and sort of develop the resources they need can kind of be stated this way. Traditional regulated markets build an energy system to provide resource adequacy. That means they build a system to meet what they project the highest amount of demand in any given year could be. And then on top of that, they add a reserve margin. So they add excess on top of what peak demand is. So they don't find themselves in a place of scarcity. So opponents to that market design will say, all right, well, the challenge here is you're building a bunch of resources that aren't getting used all the time. So it's not incredibly efficient, which I think is true. But as a practical matter, it kind of, if you have power most of the time, but when there's a lot of demand, all of your power goes out, the cost savings also disappear. So in traditionally regulated markets, they decide they're going to build for the absolute maximum demand that they can ever have. They're going to have a little bit of reserve on top of it because they've got a defined service area and low cost of capital. They're going to be able to build a really, really solid system, and they're going to be able to ensure that customer prices are low because their cost of capital is low. That's sort of the idea of the traditionally regulated model. The restructured electricity markets are kind of, as I said, built to have no excess. The idea is market signals, price signals, will sort of bankrupt plants that don't run very often. And so you're just going to have the amount of electricity that you need. The problem with that design, I think, is that when you all of a sudden need some extra electricity, there's nowhere to go get it. Like, you don't just have a power plant that pops up overnight. So that's kind of the struggle. Some of the RTOs and the deregulated markets have tried to figure out how to address this resource adequacy issue by creating what's called a capacity market. The idea being they're going to create some cash flows and revenues that can be paid directly to generators to not generate and to just be on standby. I think the concept is probably right. We haven't really seen it work yet. I think there are a lot of kinks that they've got to sort of figure out if they want to get that system to work to actually provide the resource adequacy that it aims to provide. So I just want to kind of harp on the second point. As the logic continues, customers will save money because there will be no excess generation. The only generation that remains is the generation that makes money, and most of that produces revenue because it's used regularly. I think that creates some fundamental problems. I tend to be of the opinion that the only thing that matters in the electricity world is the sort of black swan events, the bad days. I think that's really when electric supply comes into harsh focus. We saw this with Winter Storm Uri. We saw it recently with Winter Storm Elliott in the South. When you have unexpected bad weather and your electric system is really stressed, you're going to want to have excess capacity available to ensure the lights stay on. Let's see. The second point, I'll make that again. So you're sort of left with a really efficient energy system that doesn't have the power necessary. When unexpected weather comes along, customers are left with longer term outages and higher prices. I think the higher prices point is an important one to make. You'll all remember thinking back to Winter Storm Uri, which was that big storm that hit Texas in February of 2021. The sort of market in Texas, this energy only market, is designed to where, most of the time when the weather's regular, you're going to have a bunch of competition, and you're going to have all these prices driven down by a bunch of people just coming in and participating in the marketplace. Well, and you're also going to have really narrow reserve margins. Like, it's a very, very efficient market. But every now and again, you see this huge spike in demand. And when you see a huge spike in demand, you see a huge increase in electricity prices. The idea is that huge increase in electricity prices will create incentives for people to go build power plants that'll just be available at those times when there's huge increases in demand, right? That's the idea in concept. The problem is it doesn't really work that way, because what ends up happening is, in the regular times when everybody's competing on price, the people that own the generating units really aren't making that much money. They actually need those big spike in prices every couple of years to produce the revenue that they need to give back to their investors to continue to operate. It doesn't actually create the incentive for them to go build a new power plant. It actually does the opposite. it creates an incentive for them to have less supply so that they can make even more money, so that, the prices will spike. And that's one of the things that you're seeing legislators in Texas grapple with right now. There's a piece of legislation in Texas right now that's being debated that essentially would create some direct payments for some of those generators, so they could go out and build power plants that aren't used, that'll sort of exist a little bit outside the market. The last thing, and I think this is an important thing for, not the last thing, one of the other things, this is an important thing for state legislators and regulators to understand, is that it's not like, when I was saying it's not really deregulation, it's restructuring, because it's really just exporting regulation and regulatory authority. Regulatory authority over the generation assets, which in traditionally regulated markets exists with the Public Utility Commission. When you deregulate or restructure your electricity markets, you're actually just moving that regulatory authority onto another body. The regulatory authority, the one that's supposed to define what resource adequacy looks like and create all these price signals, et cetera, are these regional transmission organizations, which are sort of quasi-governmental behemoths that just manage the transmission system and dispatch. So that becomes one of the regulatory agencies. They're also the ones that run the marketplaces. The other body that you're exporting authority to is FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And you're exporting that authority there because FERC has oversight over all of those RTO groups. So if you didn't deregulate or restructure your electricity markets, the authority to determine what generation would need to be built would exist at your state public utility commission. Once you deregulate, that authority goes to these quasi-governmental organizations, the PJMs, the ERCOTs, the California ISOs, the ISO New England's. That authority goes there, and then it slides over to FERC. So, in the end, at the conclusion of kind of all of this, deregulated electricity markets are little more than an opportunity for very sophisticated buyers of electricity to, I'm really sorry about my screen, very sophisticated buyers of electricity to build sophisticated buying operations to create an opportunity to lower their prices. In exchange for the lower cost of sophisticated users, regular residential customers are left with higher costs, more volatility, and no better reliability. It's entirely possible the system that flourished when it was managed by, our ancestors could very well be superior to the system that was contrived by financial engineers on Wall Street and their cronies in boardrooms in Silicon Valley with very little experience in electricity. So that's, I guess, kind of overall my take on the differences in the marketplace. And I would love to entertain any questions that anybody might have.
All right. If you have any questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section. But I guess I'll kick it off. So one of the things we do here at ALEC is the energy affordability report, and energy affordability is one of our absolute biggest issues. I guess my question here is, between the two, in your expert opinion, what is essentially who is going to benefit, or which set is going to benefit the most people in terms of affordability?
Yep. So the traditionally regulated electricity markets have lower residential electricity costs across the board. There's not an exception. There used to be an exception. Before Winter Storm Uri, there was an exception where Texas was as cheap as the traditionally regulated markets. Since Winter Storm Uri, electricity prices in Texas have doubled, and now it's 80% higher for residential customers in Texas than it is in, say, the vertically integrated Southeast, right? Mm-hmm. So from the residential customer perspective, there's no question that traditionally regulated markets produce lower costs for residential customers. There is question, however, for how it's going to impact commercial and industrial energy users. And what ends up happening is that, like, on net, the energy costs in a deregulated market are higher for commercial and industrial than they are in a traditionally regulated market, right? Like, those costs are higher, but you don't have a regulator defining cost allocation and making everyone pay the same rate. Mm-hmm. So what ends up happening is really sophisticated users, think the Googles and Amazons and Walmarts and people like that, they figure out how to game the system and get the lowest cost possible. And all the extra costs get foisted onto the other customers that exist within that class. So it's not accurate to say that some people can't have lower costs. It's just, some people certainly can have lower costs, but it tends to be the most sophisticated users that have lower costs, and everybody else ends up with higher costs.
Okay. Well, we have our first question. So it's not directly related to the topic at hand, but our question is, do you have any thoughts about the PJM report that came out a few weeks ago about reliability?
I've read it a couple times. I'm spending a little bit more time on it, and I think the report is saying kind of the same thing that I'm saying, which is there's a bunch of scarcity in PJM. They don't have the supply to meet demand. They need to figure out how to create more price signals or something to increase energy supply. They are kind of sounding the alarm and saying we need more of this. And it gets to what I think is an interesting sort of debate and conversation right now. In the electricity world, there's a discussion right now that we're just going to build a bunch of transmission and that's going to solve all of our problems. I do think it's necessary for us to build a bunch of transmission because we've got a bunch of wind and a bunch of solar out there that we need to connect to load centers. But I don't think that's the only thing we need to be doing. Like, we need to ensure that there's dispatchable electricity that's close to home. Like, we need things like natural gas or nuclear or whatever that can be turned on when we need it. And PJM is very deficient in that respect. And the reliability report says that they're going to have to get to work and figure out how the heck they're going to get more dispatchable generation added to their system, or we're going to continue to have problems.
All right. We have our second question. So beyond commodity prices and traditional PUC rate setting processes, how do we square the riders and other costs approved by PUCs not related to fuel? So things like facility upgrades, transmission lines, or wind generation facilities, and or companies whose shareholders are pushing the procurement and usage of more expensive and less reliable fuel sources.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. There are things that I think are good to do as riders on bills. I'll give you a couple of examples. When you're thinking about things like coal ash cleanup, that might make sense as a rider. When you're thinking about something like maybe storm recovery costs, those that live down in the Gulf Coast, like, these are sort of unanticipated additional costs that kind of came up out of nowhere. I think adding those things as riders and not including them in base rates is a good idea. I think the regular operations of the business, I think those types of things should be more included in base rates. And we've kind of seen actually some legislation in Virginia that just passed that just did this. It sort of rolled up all of the riders that were on the bill and put all the riders and gave customers a $350 million savings. And then it's throwing all that stuff into base rates. I think it's a pretty good way to go. I think riders should be sort of like unanticipated costs, things that we can't plan for, that have to be paid for. I think things that we can plan for are better suited for base rates. And I think legislators have a role to play. Legislators can do that. Legislators can say stuff like that is necessary.
Okay. I Are there any other questions? Well, I guess sort of just a top line. If you had a suggestion for ALEC legislators, what would you suggest that they do, just in general?
I mean, I'm a firm believer that traditional regulation makes sense. I
Mm-hmm.
think that planning a system to meet demand makes a whole heck of a lot more sense than creating a market that's organized and run by a quasi governmental body to sort of determine what prices are going to be. Like it's kind of an obtuse design. And so I think ALEC legislators should be thinking about the sort of like traditional way to regulate a system that protects the most customers. I think that's the kind of double bottom line of how policy should really be considered. And I think, frankly, legislators have a role to also hold utilities accountable and, frankly, to direct the PUC to take some particular action. Like that is something that exists within their domain and jurisdiction. But I think they should have a voice in their head that's saying, what's going to keep my residential customers whole? What is going to ensure they are the most protected? Because, in all these other sort of designs, they're kind of left out. And it's a practical matter. If you're a policymaker, and you piss off all the voters, you're not going to be a policymaker for much longer. So I think they need to like think about it from that perspective. How can I ensure I'm delivering value and low cost and good service to just regular residential customers?
Yeah, we have another question. Do you have any thoughts on SEEM and its implications for the broader Southeast electricity market?
Yeah, I like SEEM. I think it sounds like a good idea. So to catch everybody up to speed, you've got these regional transmission organizations that that are these quasi governmental bodies, right? That sort of manage the transmission system in deregulated markets. What SEEM is doing is creating interconnection between regulated markets and allowing for the utilities in those markets to buy and sell sort of excess energy at a moment in time. So think about it like there's a Bloomberg terminal for a utility to go in and purchase excess electricity. So, you might be in Georgia and it might be a cloudy day, so your solar resources aren't showing up, right? But it might be really sunny in Kentucky. And as a result of it being really sunny in Kentucky, there's a bunch of extra solar energy that's over there in Kentucky. With SEEM, you log into that platform and you buy that really cheap solar to ship down to Georgia. That's the sort of idea, but it's not like a big agency. All they're really doing is building interconnection between the states and then putting a platform on top that allows you to go buy electricity in real time. That's the thing that doesn't really exist in the traditionally regulated markets, is that sort of platform to go and do it. The utilities buy that electricity right now in just a bilateral contract. They're just like, hey man, I'm short today. You got anything? You got anything you can sell me? And SEEM sort of modernizes a lot of that stuff and gives, frankly, like I think the real thing that it does is it allows you to sell all of your excess capacity. So if you're in a vertically integrated market, you're building to meet peak demand. You've got SEEM sort of bolted on top. Your excess energy that you don't necessarily need, you can sell it to other places, and the revenues that come from those sales are returned back to customers. So I think it's a cool idea. When I read it the first time, I was like, I don't know, this seems kind of dumb. I don't think I like it. But then as I got into the details and started to understand that it actually produces revenues for customers, I think it's a pretty good idea.
Awesome. Are there any more questions or? Well, think that might be it. Brad, thank you so much for being here and doing this explainer. And I just want to tell everyone who's here, this is going to be the first of many webinars coming up. We're going to be looking at PFAS, PFOS on the environmental side. We're going to be looking, learning a bit more about wind energy and a few other topics. So we're going to have a full dance card leading into annual meeting. Our annual meeting registration is open. It's going to be in Orlando, Florida in July, right near the parks. So it'll be a good family-friendly event. Beyond that, again, Brad, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who logged into this and everyone who watches it in the future. And I believe that is it. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for the time.